Just first of all, I'd like to welcome Pastor Ray Lowe. Should I let you introduce yourself now? Sure. Ray, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, absolutely. So my name is Pastor Ray. I flew in from New York City last night. That's where I serve as a pastor at a church in Chinatown, Lower East Side. I graduated from Gordon Conwell, which I think PJ mentioned in the sermon, and class of 2017 with a Master of Divinity. I also got a Master's in Mathematics, and I teach college math on the side as well. I'm serving as a pastor, but I also recently helped to start a nonprofit called Kaleidoscope, which is based in New York City, but we reach people across the country, focused mostly in Manhattan right now. That's one of the new endeavors that I've been starting off. Recently,
Yeah, excited. I'm sure, hopefully you'll have opportunity to share more about Kaleidoscope. That sounds really exciting.
Absolutely.
Let me kind of set the table for us.
Sure.
I wasn't fully listening, but I caught part of what you shared. But we met. I met you through Bill Henson,
Yes.
which was a apostleship training, a training for churches who hold the tradition of view of marriage, but how to kind of navigate and how to love the LGBT. And Ray came out and did a testimony. So that's how we originally met Ray. And you kept in touch with some of our members, and the opportunity presented itself that I think, Ray, you shared that if there's any way you could bless our church, that you're open and willing to do that, and here we are. So praise God just for today and for you being here. Thank you so much. Can we give him a round? Welcome, I guess, warm welcome.
Thank you. Great.
I do hope to talk less and let Ray talk more, but once again, setting the table. If you're newer to CEC, we have a position paper on, homosexuality. So if you don't have that or you don't know about it, we can share that with you. So just contact me and we'll get that to you. The basic gist of it is, I guess, what you could say is holy sexuality, that sex is for marriage, inside marriage, and otherwise it is not approved. So that's in short. The church believes in holy sexuality, and once again, I think I briefly mentioned it, but it's a traditional view of marriage between a man and a woman. So in other terms, we're not a non-affirming church. That's the right terminology, right? So that's just kind of setting the table of who we are, CEC. Some may agree with that, and some may disagree with that. But we're not here to debate that this morning, but we're here to work together, and we're here to dialogue together how we can minister the gospel to all and everyone. And I believe that's what Jesus did. He didn't just, only go to the synagogues. He did go to synagogues, but he went out and preached the gospel, the kingdom, and healed, all people. So as Christians, followers of Jesus Christ, we want to do that also. Is how can we minister? How can we love any and everyone, including the gay community? So I think that's kind of hopefully sets the table. Where do we want to go from here?
Yeah. I don't know, yeah. Well, yeah, I'll just follow up with that, saying that I'm really happy to be here. And I think when we first talked about this, it started off, I think, a little bit as a presentation, right? Which I've given before. I get invited to a lot of churches, particularly the Asian churches, which really shows the need for representation in this area too, to speak about my own experiences, but also to speak towards LGBT issues and how the church can better love. The opportunity came up to have this as a presentation, but one of the things that I got the idea of was that, hey, why don't we have this as a dialogue? Because I've been here 3 years ago, and we did a whole seminar here through Posture Shift, Lead Them Home. And I think that's the wonderful thing about that, is that the pastors, that shows that the pastors have already been a part of this conversation. And so I think the dialogue works really well because if I just come in as a guest speaker, I give a presentation and I just leave, anybody is free to be like, oh, I didn't really agree with that. Oh, this person is speaking nonsense. It was a guest speaker, so let's just move on. But to show that the pastors are having a dialogue about this and that the leadership at your church is having a conversation about this, I think is a very powerful thing too. So I hope that's something that can come out to get today. And I hope it's not just me, even just speaking towards LGBT issues, but it's also the pastors, and you can see your leaders really engaging as well too. So yeah.
Thank you. Should we jump right into it then?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay. So we did meet and we did talk briefly. I don't know how this is exactly going to go, but we have some questions that we thought we'd ask each other. And getting to the heart of it, the title, we called it this LGBT dialogue, but the subtitle is Practical Ways to Love the LGBT Community. So I'm going to start off asking that to Pastor Ray. What are a few ways that we can love our LGBTQ friends, I guess more personally, individually?
Sure, yeah. So I think a lot of people ask this question, especially because, we'll talk a little bit towards this later, but a lot of people see the church not really engaging with it, and they're like, okay, I don't feel very equipped. So one of the first questions is, how do I reach the LGBTQ community in my own lives, my own friendships, my own relationships? So I think the first thing that I would really encourage is that when we are loving our LGBTQ friends, that we think like missionaries. Honestly, the same practices that I know every church kind of brings to its missions is things like learning the history of a people group, the culture, the specific needs in the specific areas of injustice, and also the language, the kind of terminology that is welcomed within the community, but maybe also the language that is not as acceptable or is a little bit outdated. So I think I really encourage people to do that, to think like a missionary as well, particularly because this is a people group that has, in many ways, experienced a lot of hurt and discrimination by the church, and a lot of distance has been built between the LGBTQ community and the church. So that's why I really encourage things like education and history. But I also encourage things like education about injustice as well, because injustice still happens within the LGBT community, and it still happens in our world today. Within the past 3 years, there's been a number of different suicides that have happened, amongst LGBTQ youth as well, and that's happened in the past 3 years too. So it's a very recent thing, and it also happens in the military as well. I believe a suicide happened this past May from a woman who was came out as a lesbian, as assaulted in the military as well too. So that was a very sad thing, right? To see that somebody who is serving our country could experience this kind of discrimination as well. So I say all this because in our personal relationships and our personal friendships with LGBTQ community, they're thinking about these things, right? They're thinking about the latest suicide. They're thinking about the rejection and the pain and the marginalization. They're thinking about the fact that people don't want them there, that so many people have made them feel as dehumanized as they feel, and in many ways dehumanized enough to take their own lives as well. So oftentimes in our conversations, we don't even acknowledge these things. We talk about the gospel, we talk about sin, we talk about sexual immorality, but we don't talk about the injustices and the stigmas and the hurts that the LGBT community has experienced in the past. Most prominently with the Orlando Pulse shooting that happened 5 years ago. In June, the taking the lives of 49 people, that still rings very, very weightily to the LGBTQ community today. So an acknowledgement of all these things is already a good conversation avenue points, right, towards addressing some of the hurts, addressing some of the pain, and addressing some of the healing that needs to happen between the church and the LGBT community. So that's what I really encourage with, like leading with justice, leading with action, and having that be the conversation point for a lot of healing and reconciliation, and just a lot of very, very powerful moments that can happen in our personal conversations as well, too. So, yeah. So I'll lead off with. Yeah,
thanks, Ray. I remember Bill Henson. If you're not familiar with him, you can probably Google him. But in what you shared, just that it was like a paradigm shift, a game changer for me, of thinking about the LGBT community as like an unreached people group, like a missionary, like sure. I think you mentioned, and learning about them. and understanding maybe the language and stuff. So I love that. The first thing is just learning about this community, understanding kind of some of the history and like the trauma and stuff. That's a great start, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Where do you want to go?
Sure. I mean, in following up with that, I guess like your leadership kind of invited Bill Henson from Posture Shift here. So I guess one of the questions, just to set the stage too, also for not just why the church, but why CEC too, right? So I guess one of the questions I would love to ask is, what are some of the ways that your leadership have seen the need for this conversation within the church? So.
Okay. Well, first of all, I believe it's been one of the biggest cultural issues of our day. I don't know what the time period is, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But it's been one of the biggest cultural issues that society has been I don't know, talking about, dealing with. But I think even more than that, so CEC and personally, individually, personally, I guess, we've had some folks come out, as gay in our college group, I think also potentially in the youth group, in our young adult group. People have come out. So this is a topic that affects our body, personally and really. And it was, something that sometimes you're not willing to admit. And we've had other leaders, kind of try to deny the reality. Oh no, there's nobody who's LGBT at our church or something. But no, people have come out. So it affects us. Yeah. So I think that's, in terms of engaging with culture, in terms of ministering to those who are with us and are us. I think that's why there's, I think, a need to engage in this conversation.
Sure. Yeah, there's a statistic that shows that 31% of young people are leaving the church because of the church's treatment of this issue. And that's very jarring statistic if you think about it. That means that almost 1 in every 3 people are leaving the church because it has not engaged with this issue well. And that's convicting to me as a pastor as well, because I'm like, do we even talk about this a third of the time? Do we talk about this in a third of our sermons or our Bible studies? Probably not, So it really does show the need for this conversation, that the people are thinking about these things too in their minds.
Yeah, and as you mentioned that, I'm trying to remember the source, but I think it was the Us versus Us book.
Yes.
Was it Marin or something?
Andrew Marin, yeah.
Andrew Marin, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but sorry, I should let you share this.
No, please, yeah.
But
this is good. This is like the
no, but like from the gay community, a high percentage of them were church, grew up in the church. Do you remember the number?
I think it was about 70 plus.
70+% of the gay community had grown up or had experienced, been in church. 70%?
About 70%.
Around there, right?
Yeah.
And then I think it's kind of the impetus for Posture Shift, and I think it's for us, but they said out of that 70%, a certain percentage would be willing to go back to church. They didn't require a change of position, because I set the table in the beginning saying this is our church's position.
Yeah.
They didn't require a change of position, but simply like just being treated lovingly and kindly, caring, and that's Bill Henson's ministry, Posture Shift. We just need to shift our posture. And I forget, do you know the percentage?
It's about 85% plus. Yeah,
wow.
I would say that they do not require a theology change to come back to church.
And that's huge. That's staggering. So 70% have been in church in the gay community, and 85?
About 85+%.
85% of that 70% would be willing to come back to church if we just simply loved them and treated them with respect, right?
Sure, absolutely.
That's huge for me. So, I think that's also answers the questions for the need. It's like, we need to do this. It's there. The statistics are telling us that it's possible, but it's a challenge.
Yeah.
So, if you want to continue to unpack any ways that we as a church or personally individually can love our any gay friends that we might have, but how about how can we do it corporately or as the body? What are some practical steps for us as a church?
Sure, yeah. I think one of the things that resonates with us a lot as Asian Americans, and this is why I love having this conversation in the Asian American church, is that we care about something called representation. Right? Shang-Chi just came out this past weekend, and so many people are tweeting about it. So many people are flocking to the theaters, right? Hopefully masking up, hopefully getting vaccinated, but flocking to the theaters and saying, hey, we're here to show up for this movie. We're here to feel represented. And we are here because Asians deserve that representation in the media. And I think that really rings true with the LGBTQ community as well. Representation in our leadership, representation in our conversations as well. I didn't get too much into my own story, but as a gay celibate pastor, I embody kind of the call to singleness, the call to celibacy, but also this call to really be one in experience with that kind of pain and that rejection and that marginalization that LGBTQ people have experienced. And so that kind of representation in our leadership, I think, is a very powerful thing. For a young LGBTQ person growing up in our churches to see that there are leaders who have, wrestled with this, who have gone on this journey, and wherever they've come out, right, like they just be able to thrive in that too. Thrive in their story, thrive in their journey, and thrive in where God is calling them in their lives. I think those things are very powerful. So one of the things I encourage churches to do is to think very intentionally about how you're representing the LGBTQ community amongst your leadership, but also maybe even in your testimonies, the stories that you feature, the illustrations that you feature as well. Another thing is, I think you did this really well, is acknowledging that LGBTQ people do exist within the church as well. Just a kind of like a biblical basis, one of my favorite things to share is about Luke 15. We have those three parables about the lost sheep, lost coin, and lost son. And interestingly enough, we kind of focus on the first one and the last one a lot, right? We talk about the prodigal son, the father, right? Like lavish love, right? Like coming out and embracing the son. The first one talks about the sheep, the 99, right? Going out, leaving the 99 and going after the one lost sheep. And we even wrote a controversial worship song about it too. But we don't talk as much about the coin. We don't talk about the second one as much. And as a middle child, I can kind of relate to that sentiment as well, being forgotten. But if you read that passage over again, you see that it's this woman who loses a coin, and she lights a lamp and she sweeps her house carefully and searches until she finds her treasure. And what sticks out to me about this is that this woman, for one thing, showing very motherly and very caring tendencies of God as well. But also, she knows that the coin is somewhere within the house. If you notice, the first and the third stories, the sheep and the son, were somewhere outside of the house. They were lost. They were somewhere out there. But the woman knows that the coin is somewhere inside the house. She doesn't retrace her steps. She doesn't go back to the village where she came from. She doesn't call up her friends. Maybe she lost it in their house. And she knows that it's somewhere in the house, and she searches carefully until she finds it. I think as churches, oftentimes we talk about the LGBTQ community as if they're somewhere out there. We use the words them a lot, they. But recognizing that the LGBTQ community does exist within our own walls, I think, is a very powerful thing. And I believe that God is a missionary in this aspect, not just going out and reaching the lost, but also lighting a lamp, sweeping away some of the prejudice, some of the stigmas, some of the hatred and the judgment within his own church walls, and sweeping it all away so that he can find his lost treasure. So I think that's something that does require a shift in our attitude, our posture, and our languages, as PJ has shared. And I think that's something that can be really powerful for LGBTQ people. And lastly, I think our programs as well. What are our programs geared towards? Churches definitely have a lot of things like, couples ministry or, married folks ministry. Babysitting seems to be a very big thing that, oftentimes, right, like, it supports married families and it supports this idea of this the traditional family unit, but it doesn't as much support our single folks. It doesn't really support our divorced or widowed, or of course our LGBTQ folks as well. So starting to think about how we can reorient our programs to be more to be widened, right, and to be more inclusive of different people in different stages of their life, I think can be really powerful too.
Yeah, I love that. I've been thinking about it, and maybe we can talk more offline, but ministry to singles is something that the church definitely kind of overlooks, and there's maybe a young adult, but then what about not so young adult? Yeah, what about the if it's divorced or widowed or stuff? So that, I love that we have to rethink the ministries. That's really good.
Well, on that note, what are some? Let's start positive. What are some positive things actually that you've seen CEC do?
I guess I don't know if I have a high standard or low standard, but I kind of hope for more. But what we've done or positive things is we are at least talking about it. I just remember having conversations with different people, my father included, is like, oh, and I shared that we're going to talk about, LGBT. And he's like, oh, is your church ready for that? I'm like, Dad, we're like 20 years late on this or something like that. So I guess, historically speaking, we've had Christopher Yen come. If you know who Christopher Yen is, how do I describe it? Who's Christopher Yen?
Christopher Yen? Oh yeah. So
you can help me out there.
I know him very lightly as an acquaintance. But honestly, when I was growing up, right, to see myself once again as an Asian American doing prominent leadership and talking about this issue, right, and paving the way for this conversation, I think I was very inspired by him too. He's a man who basically he did not grow up in the faith or anything like that. His parents did not also grow up in the faith. They were Chinese immigrants from Taiwan, I believe. And basically, Chris grew up. He left behind the doctor lifestyle and everything like that, right? And he actually decided to come out as gay, right? And he partied a lot. He got engaged with the drug scene, and he ended up getting thrown in jail because of it. And within jail as well, he was diagnosed with HIV/AIDS too. And of course, during the time, there was not as much good treatment, solid treatment for it as well too. So that was basically a death sentence for him. During this time, his mom actually ended up finding Jesus, and so she gave her life to Christ, and she started praying very regularly for her son. She would make a list of blessings, and she would thank God for them, and she would lift up a request day after day for her son. So if anything, I think this really is a powerful, powerful moment of his mother, who was praying for him over and over again to receive Jesus. And finally, within the confines of a jail cell, he did. And now he's a professor at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, and he goes around speaking with his mom about the story. So I believe y'all.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's a very full answer. Thank you. So we've had Christopher Yen come, and he wrote a book, and he spoke here, and that was part of the impetus for us forming that position paper. He blessed us. And so I think that's a positive that he came. Remind me though, Ray, you had mentioned it briefly, but your testimony, I want to hear more about that. But I'll finish answering this one. So Christopher Yen came, I forget how many years ago, but he came. And I also mentioned it. Bill Henson came. He trained the elders 2 days, 2 full days, 16 hours, is it? Something like that. Wow. Posture shift, as we've mentioned before. So the elders are trained. Bill Henson came back again and did one night kind of crash course in an hour or two for the congregation, had some question and answers. So we had Bill Henson come. From the posture shift material and stuff, they encourage the churches to basically develop a inclusion model, where, I think it goes to say that the gay community has felt excluded by the church. And so where can the church include the gay community as part of the body, various roles and stuff. And so maybe some places you can't, but where can you? So if not one place, area of service, maybe here's 2 other places. So to develop a inclusion model, which we've been working on, I want to say near completion, but we're still working on that. And then lastly, I think as a positive, we're talking about it. Maybe maybe not as consistently, but we are talking about it. But there is a discussion group that's working on creating a vision for a place for discussing the topic of LGBT. And if you're interested in this group that is currently meeting, please reach out to me and I can connect you with them. So I think that's some of the positive is we are talking about it. I do not think we have arrived. I do not think we have it down, but that's the positive I think for the church is that we're talking about it, and hopefully that's a beginning and a start.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome that that you can kind of. It's a lot to bear for one thing. I want to acknowledge that, right? And it's a lot of weightiness, and even you saying that you want to see more happen too, right? I think is a very positive thing for people to see that you're constantly working on it. And I think the need for continued discussion and kind of your ability to kind of bless that, I think, is very powerful as well too. So that's wonderful for me to see.
So I don't know if now is a good time, and I don't know. How long you want to spend on it. But I would love to hear more of your testimony.
Sure, yeah. Well, for myself, I didn't grow up in the church either. I don't have a very similar story to Christopher Yen, but I did start going to the church. I grew up in Chicago as well, just the suburbs. So he and I have that in common, but I did not grow up in the church. I grew up in a pretty comfortable suburbs. It was diverse, but this was the early 2000s too, right? So there's still a lot of things like racism going around, but also society as a whole was very homophobic as well. There was a lot of gay slurs and jokes, and it was just generally seen as a degrading thing. Even outside of the church too, it's important to note that society as a whole back then. So actually, I was very, very curious. I actually traced this kind of like rampant judgment and hatred back to the church too. I was like, oh wow, it seems to come from Christians, and it seems to have been propagated by Christians. So I did more research, I did more learning about the history. But then I just started going to church because I was like, you know what, this doesn't make sense to me. My very analytical mind told me this doesn't make sense. If God is so loving, why are his people so hateful towards LGBT community? And of course, as I was beginning to realize my own feelings and my own attractions towards other men, that was something that was very personally to me as well. So I am fortunate enough to have gone to a church. I started going to a church. It was also Chinese immigrants. It was part of the Missionary Alliance. But the youth pastor at this church was just incredibly, incredibly loving. He ran a group of about 60 to 70 kids, but he just always seemed to give each and every one of them ample attention, And I love that about him. It just showed me a different kind of leadership, a different kind of community as well. And so when I finally came out to about 40 people during one of those open mic sharing testimony times, as you can imagine and probably have seen before, he was just so loving, and he was so welcoming to my story, and just really everybody there told me that they would walk alongside me in my journey. And I think the best thing that my youth pastor did for me is what I think we would want from our pastors, is to really treat this issue like a very personal thing. To not make it about the politics, but about the person. And he really did that, honestly, by just discipling me like any other. He taught me how to pray. He taught me how to experience intimacy with God. And he taught me how to read those scriptures, right, and to wrestle with them very, very, very honestly and genuinely. He would never preach at me. He would never make sure that I believed what he believed about it or his interpretation about it. He just treated me as somebody who was a follower of Christ. And I think those were the foundations, the faith foundations is the word that I like to use, that I carried with me into college, because coming to NYU, it could have been a very, very, a place where I walked away from my faith. The big city, you're on your own for the first time, you're very independent. But because of these faith foundations, I kept coming back to my faith over and over again. And it was halfway through college that I decided that, just like my youth pastor, I wanted to go into ministry as well. And so that's where I applied for Gordon Conwell, went there and graduated. So up to this point, I had kind of experienced more positive thing from the church, right? And I'm very, very grateful to God for that. But it was only after seminary that I actually started to, I guess, realize the depth of this conversation, where God began to open my eyes to, things like how the rhetoric was rampantly changing during that time. The 2016 election happened, and it brought a lot of anti-LGBTQ sentiments out again. And also my old college fellowship went through kind of a scandal in that aspect as well, too. So I just began to see over and over again that LGBTQ people continue to be ostracized by the church, and I experienced it very, very personally when I myself was fired from my first job for being LGBTQ as well. And that was a very difficult thing for me because I had tried my best to be very honest and very open about my own journey, my own call to singleness and celibacy, and just my desire to really be a leader in this conversation and to provide a voice in this, right? But oftentimes the worst part about this is that the very people who should be the strongest voices in this conversation are often the ones that are shut out of it. The leadership often doesn't invite those voices in, and I think thinking about being Asian is also this idea that you're also never good enough, right? You always feel like you're never good enough for your parents. You feel like you're not a good enough American for our country. And so doing all the right things, being part of college fellowship, being part of youth group, and also graduating from seminary, I felt like I was doing all the right things, but it was not good enough for the church. And I think that was the hardest part of my own journey and my realization that this conversation does need a lot of help. And that if nobody was going to extend that hand to me, then I did not know where my own place was in the world. I just didn't feel like I had a place in this world anymore. So that led to a huge period of just depression and anxiety for myself. I'm thankful enough that I did end up getting hired by a church after that, a lot more open to the conversation, and I served there for 4 years and ended up resigning very recently to start Kaleidoscope as well. So just parts of the journey that have been hard and very difficult. I've seen God's faithfulness, but I do think it's very significant that my testimony isn't I was so bad, I was so lost, and then I found Jesus. It was actually, things were pretty good. And then God showed me kind of the difficulties of this world and just the negative stigmas and just the need for conversation around this issue that continues to happen too. So not a very traditional testimony, but I think God was still very present in it, and he still is present to this very day in his faithfulness. So
yeah, thanks for sharing that. I can only imagine how hurtful that was to be let go by the church. Simply for who you are, not necessarily even anything you did, right? So thank you for sharing that. Yeah. If you're willing, yeah. we didn't necessarily talk about this, but I'm just curious. Would you share more about how perhaps you've been received by family and friends?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Yeah, that's great. Great question, especially. We're very family-oriented, I think, especially in our own culture, too. So I think this is a very difficult thing, and this is why I'm really happy for the opportunity to blend a lot of diverse voices in the conversation. And that's one thing that Kaleidoscope is actually very, very insistent on, bringing in the Asian American perspective, bringing in the Black American perspective, because a young LGBTQ person growing up in a suburban white evangelical family is going to have a very different experience than an immigrant family that moved here and basically worked its way towards surviving really in this country too. So that kind of experience is very different. And so I'm thankful enough for my own family that my parents weren't, kind of tiger moms or typical Asian parents. They didn't kind of force any kind of career path on me. They didn't really push me in either direction. And when I wanted to be a pastor, they were genuinely able to support it, right? And, they helped me pay my tuition for seminary too, so I'm really grateful for that. I think that sentiment in the same way carried itself over into when I came out to them. And, it was this idea that they... obviously, it was a very hard thing for them to accept and reconcile with, but also they didn't kind of bring this idea of control or need to kind of push me in a direction. They let me figure it out on my own, and they trust me. I think that's the biggest thing. They trusted me to make good decisions about my career, but also my own personal life as well, too. So I'm really thankful to my parents for that. I know for a lot of youth that I work with, though, that's not the case, and especially children of immigrants. I think there's so many more unique aspects that Asians have to go through, right? One of the biggest things is like language barrier. Like, how do you even have this conversation with a parent who doesn't speak English very well and can't even engage with things like, why this term is maybe not as helpful as that term, or why you can't really say this anymore, but you have to talk about the conversation in this way. That's really hard as well. And so there's a lot of cultural and language barriers that make it very difficult for family. I'll bring this in. I think it's very significant that as Asian Americans started to be attacked throughout the country, with a lot of the perpetrators actually being people of color, we had to have a very honest awakening and reckoning with kind of our place in this country. And for a lot of my very activist-oriented friends, it was this idea that our Asian parents are being attacked right now. They're vulnerable right now, and they are being targeted because Asians are just generally seen as weaker and as foreign and exotic. At the same time, right, when we have these conversations with our grandparents, with our parents, many of whom are very, very racist towards Black and Hispanic people, we have to both affirm our parents' right to protection, but also deny this idea of stereotyping, this idea of painting everybody as violent, or this idea of trying to target different individuals because of their race. And that's kind of like the balance that we have to hold as in our place in society. And I think the same thing we have to really reconcile with LGBT people. The same way that we are challenging our parents, we're affirming their own kind of how much they gave up for us, how much they have sacrificed for us, just the experiences that they went through as immigrants, while still denying this idea that anti-LGBT sentiment is okay, or is okay, is all right, or is approved of too. So kind of it's that push and pull, right? It's that push and pull of affirming, denying too. So I think we're really, really wrestling with that a lot,
Yeah. Thanks. I think there is that tension of generational differences within the Asian culture. And it is a little bit of a, the balance and the tension there. I think you started talking about it, but if you have more to say, but you talked about language, and I know personally it's a challenge sometimes to understand maybe what words are okay, what words are not, and be sensitive to that, to love the LGBT community with words that won't hurt or won't offend. So if you have more practical tips on kind of just how we can love with our words, that'd be great.
Sure. So I'll give kind of both things to avoid, but also positive things that we can lean into. The first foremost I think is lifestyle. The word lifestyle has a lot of baggage because it's kind of linked towards the behavior of LGBTQ people, and it's this idea that you adopt a lifestyle and therefore you live out of it, and therefore in many ways you are worthy of judgment or condemnation. That's how the church has seen it and talked about it. But for a lot of LGBTQ people, lifestyle, it's not their lifestyle, it is literally who they are. It's an outward expression of their being. And so, the word lifestyle, I think, rings very, very negatively on a lot of ears these days. So I think those are a very simple one that we can begin to erase from our language, which I'm still trying to do as well. Practicing homosexual is also one that's just very outdated. Love the sinner, hate the sin, those kinds of things that you really focus on the issue itself rather than the actual person, right? Even love the sin or hate the sin kind of is a very dismissive way of wrapping this into a neat little bow, right? And saying like, hey, it's just as simple as love, without acknowledging the kinds of struggles that LGBTQ people have gone through and the unique struggles that they have had to face, particularly at the hands of the church. So those kinds of languages, even the word same-sex attraction, I know this is probably the hardest one for a lot of people coming from a more traditional church, can ring very negatively towards people outside of the church, and that's particularly because it's been linked to a lot of conversion therapy programs that have existed in the past few decades, and this idea of same-sex attraction has a lot of negative stigma around it as well, and can be a trigger for a lot of people. So those are some things to avoid. Something that might be helpful, though, some things that actually generate conversation rather than end conversation. First and foremost is I'm sorry, I think, especially as we think about what it means to apologize corporately. Daniel actually does that in Daniel chapter 9. He prays and he uses we language. Daniel is the guy who is very obedient to God. He wasn't the person who needed to apologize on behalf of his people, but he does so anyways. And I think there's a lot of power in the way that we do that. There's a lot of power in corporate repentance when the church kind of collectively acknowledges, I'm part of a people who has historically hurt LGBTQ people, and I want to see us change. Other things are like, tell me about your partner. I think this is an interesting thing that I've noticed is that when this topic comes up and when somebody comes out, a lot of people are, nowadays, especially in the church, are like, oh, okay, still want to love you, still want to get to know more, still want to treat you with love and kindness. But then they never ask about things like, who's your partner, right? Like, tell me about how your relationship's going. Tell me about who you like. Tell me about who you don't like. What do you feel attracted to in person? Those kinds of things that just normalize kind of how a person feels. I think, that's something that we can definitely work on too, because imagine not being able to talk about your partner or your wife, with somebody in a small group. Imagine not being able to talk about your job with other people that you're passionate about. These are things that mean a lot to the LGBTQ community, and so not acknowledging those things, I think, is a way that they can feel very excluded as well, even if you kind of accept them on the surface, And I think, what can I do as a Christian to make you feel safer? I think that's a huge, powerful thing that I think we can extend towards other people, and we're inviting LGBTQ people to teach us and educate us about how they feel loved and how we can love them in their journey and their walk too. So all these things are, I think, there's so many more, but can start to generate conversation rather than close it by using outdated terms, or the moment you say something already, it's kind of a shutdown for a lot of people. So.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. I know in my past and my probably recent past, I probably messed up a bunch. I just was thinking as you were sharing, Ray, one of my sisters came out gay. Mm-hmm. And when she shared with me, she came out to me, I just didn't want to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And you're like, one of the things is just to ask about the partner, or ask about their life, I was like, oh, we don't talk about that. And she didn't get mad at me, but I just avoided it. Mm. And that's not the loving thing to do. I mean, I'll talk to her about it now, but when she first came out, I was just, okay, like, my sister's gay, so definitely that's a great tip, is don't just avoid it, actually ask about it. It may make you feel uncomfortable, I would say, probably, for some of us, but it's a way to show love, that you show interest, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
On that note, what are some areas of struggle or need for improvement that you've seen the leadership in the church go through, too, like more specific to CEC, I guess? So.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of struggle, and I think there's a lot of room for improvement. I think we've grown. I think we've grown as a body, CEC. And as I mentioned, some of the positives is, we're starting to talk about it, but there's a lot of room for growth. I think just in some circles here at church, I know we had to stop with gay jokes, of making light of it and like, haha, you're gay, or whatever the gay jokes are, to stop with that, because they were said and shared in this building, in this room, sure. Gay jokes. So I think there's growth in there, but we're guilty of that, so we struggle with that. Like you said, the church has spoken not kindly about LGBT. So that's been a struggle, and hopefully some growth in there. I said this years ago. I actually preached a couple sermons about loving the LGBT several years ago, but. And I was going to say this before you shared it, but I think historically, by and large, the church has failed to love the gay community. I think it's just not that hard to see. The church has failed, and I think also specifically and personally, CEC and myself specifically, I've failed to love gay brothers and sisters. And I got permission, and one person specifically is Julian, and he's here with us. I failed my brother to love him, as I should. I know we've hurt him. I know we've hurt as a result of the process, and just struggled to love him and others in the gay community. The church has failed. It is humbling. It is hard. But hopefully we can continue to grow, and continue to struggle in it, because it may not be easy. but I hope that we will continue to struggle in it, and you mentioned some things about like, suicide, or even just, your dismissal from church, and how devastating that was for you. And I have some other pastor friends that and it wasn't even about, their identity, but just like go from a church to be like fired, and other treatment, just can have really a negative impact and hurt people. And I think as the church, as a Christian, I don't think that's our goal or intent is to hurt anybody, but it's happening. And so we need to reckon with that. And hopefully, it may not be easy, but we'll continue to work and grow in that.
Wow. That's very powerful. Thank you. Yeah. I think maybe the last question for you, and then we'll do some Q&A. Yeah.
But, so we've talked about some ways we can practically love individually, our friends, maybe the church, and some language and words. And you shared some with the youth pastor that loved on you. But what are some practical ways that you've received love? Maybe not family, maybe not youth pastor, but what are some practical ways that you can remember? Like, somebody took me out for coffee, or somebody asked, what are some practical ways that you've been loved by Christians?
Yeah, that's great. I think some of my closest Christian friends are brothers who have not gone through the same experience, but have honestly just taken that step forward and tried to understand, right? I think there's always this tension between how much I want to feel seen in that somebody who knows exactly what I go through, right? An LGBTQ person, and there are a lot of LGBTQ siblings of mine who have understood that, right? And I kind of can feel seen and very understood and loved in that. But I think there's a certain power to the love of a person who is not LGBTQ reaching out and trying to understand how that feels. And so some practical examples, I think, is, one time that I was like just really hurting over a person, hurting over a friend that I had strong feelings for. And my other friend, he was talking with me about it and sitting with me in that. And he came from also a conservative evangelical background. He came from Texas, and he just sat with me, and I think there was a question that I asked. I was like, I think, what was the question I asked? It's been a while since I shared this story, but it was like, I just don't understand why the Bible would say something like this. Right? All I said was like everything with the gospel, everything with kind of like, sin, salvation, right? Like the idea, as PJ talks about these days, about kind of the death and the sacrifice, but also the ascension and the resurrection. All those things make sense to me, right? But there's just one part of the Bible that just doesn't make sense to me. And I was like, I just don't understand. Is it just because God says so, or is there something deeper to it, right? I just don't understand. And this guy, who is one of the most knowledgeable guys that I know, he's studying for a PhD right now. He's going to be a professor, something like that. But he's the kind of guy that would respond to that with the right answer, the right words to say, the right theological reflection. But the one thing that he said that I remember forever is that he just said, I don't know why either. And I think sitting in that and that kind of response was his way of entering into my confusion, entering into my pain, and entering into the uncertainty that often plagues this conversation about the church and the LGBTQ community. It's that he was embodying this I don't know either kind of mentality that I've had to wrestle with for a long time. So I share that story as a way to say that I think some of the most powerful thing is when we embody what Jesus Christ did, and when we step from our world into another person's world, when we embody somebody else's flesh, and even if we can't fully understand what they're going through, we at least try intentionally to understand, to listen, to learn, and to love them even within that space too. So I think that's, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's very encouraging for me, because okay, so it's walking with and listening and engaging, but the simple answer is like, I don't know. Like that could be an encouraging thing. So I'm encouraged by that and blessed by that story. Thank you, Ray. Why don't we, for the remaining time, our time is generally 11 to 12:15, so we got about 15 minutes or so. For Q&A, for questions that you might have for Ray here, I don't know if we need mics. I think we're small enough and that you can just kind of speak up. Anybody have questions for Ray?
Or for PJ too.
just for Ray. Huh? Oh, there's a microphone. Yes.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Hey, so one of the things that you mentioned was like the term lifestyle has a lot of baggage to it. But also I think in the church there's like this idea that like, oh, if you say someone is gay, then that means that they are in a relationship or so there seems like, oh, but there still feels like there's a distinction sometimes that I feel like I need to make if I'm having a conversation with someone about LGBTQ plus issues. Yeah. I'm curious if there's any ways to make that distinction that doesn't have negative connotations or baggage to it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the wonderful thing about language is that it changes over time too. The stigmas behind a language is so different than it was 20 years ago. You can think about certain labels, certain people groups that have negative stigmas now that they maybe didn't have 20 years ago. I'm talking about politics, of course. And you know, when it comes to the word gay, right? Perhaps back then, right? Back then, to say the word gay was definitely that was a identifier for somebody who is in a relationship with somebody of the same gender and who is pursuing relationships of people with the same gender. But nowadays, the word gay is used to describe a common experience of growing up, experiencing attraction towards the same gender, and for a lot of people, right, that experience comes with a lot of baggage, a lot of trauma, a lot of rejection and fear, as we've already talked about. So just like how I use the word Asian American Christian to identify myself as somebody who grew up in an immigrant church, somebody who has, you know, experienced all these kinds of cultural journeys that somebody, you know, that I don't even know would be able to, right, as well as Asian American Christians. The same thing, right, for the term gay. It does not necessarily imply these days that a person is pursuing a same-sex relationship, but it does kind of identify that common experience too. But we are getting kind of into the technicalities of it too, right? You know, things like terms like celibacy and stuff like that is how I used to self-describe myself to identify that I'm not pursuing a same-sex relationship. But I think even just like qualifying it too, right? Like saying that a person is gay, but you know they have chosen to follow, you know, singleness, the path of singleness, or if the other way around, right? Like a person is gay and they are pursuing a same-sex relationship. I think those qualifiers are very helpful too, because even though it's a little bit longer, it does invite the conversation too, right? People hear that and they're like, oh, tell me more. Tell me more about a gay person who has chosen to live a life of singleness. And I think those things promote conversation rather than end them too. So, yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
Any questions?
Julian here. Thank you for sharing your story. Yeah, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the history between the church and LGBTQ community.
Sure.
In particular, like what kind of history would the church need to apologize for if they decided to, and what are some of the things especially that might have been experienced in older generations?
Sure. Yeah, well, this Bill actually brought 4 periods, so I want to give credit to him, of time and history that the church has gone through with the LGBTQ community. There's the age of silence where it just wasn't talked about at all, and a lot of LGBTQ people were expressing themselves in silence and you know, behind the scenes. But then we moved on to the next phase, which actually came with technology, the age of expulsion, because once television came out, right? Like people started coming out in drove numbers. People started identifying themselves as LGBTQ. They saw themselves on screen, right? So they were like, okay, wow, I feel confident enough. But of course, with that, you know, many people coming out in drove numbers also meant that they were being expelled from their churches, from their families. A lot of LGBTQ people were kicked out of their homes and disowned. 40% of the homeless population in New York City itself is LGBTQ, and for this very issue. And then we moved on to the age of, you know, that we talked about, things like age of culture wars. You know, that's when the LGBTQ rights movement came about, alongside the civil rights movement. But then alongside that emerged the religious right. And that was a political and cultural movement started by evangelical leaders to take away the rights of LGBTQ people, take away the rights of certain racial minorities as well too. So that was a political movement to do things like workplace discrimination, housing discrimination, those kinds of things. And then finally, we moved to the age of social justice, where a lot of LGBTQ people are embodying this identity, this label, and really living out of that identity, right? And fighting for inclusion, equality, those kinds of things, right? So I think definitely that second and third phase, you could probably say, are kind of when the church itself was probably the most active about rejecting, right, and mistreating LGBTQ people and kind of being on the forefront of that movement, especially here in America too. So there's definitely a lot to acknowledge in that aspect. So yeah, thanks for asking.
Do you have any years on those, or just rough?
I'm so bad.
It's okay. It's okay. I just
I finished my
No worries, no
class
worries.
and then I just moved right on.
no worries. No worries.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Go for it again. Oh, there's another one. You can always move that.
Hi, and I'm sorry, you may have mentioned this in the beginning because I was a few minutes late,
No
but you did say that you started Kaleidoscope.
Yes.
And what in particular does Kaleidoscope do?
Sure, absolutely. I suppose we were gonna get to that towards the end too, but I can just share now. So Kaleidoscope was a nonprofit ministry organization started with a vision to do much of the same things that kind of Bill Henson was doing with Posture Shift and Lead Them Home. But one of the things that we really wanted to more intentionally lean on were two things. Local. We wanted to really start off in kind of New York City because just even local partnerships with pastors can be sustained over time. It's so wonderful that I was able to reconnect with CEC after 3 years, but I think even just knowing that there are people doing this ministry in New York City, I think it is an encouragement to a lot of the pastors that we work with in Manhattan, in Brooklyn, and Queens as well. So that local, I think, is very... we live in a very virtual age too, right? We want to access everybody, but I think the heart of the gospel is local and personal and very intimate kind of groups of people and relationships that end up changing lives. The second thing is multi-ethnic. I've mentioned that before too. Our two founders are a white woman and a black and Mexican woman, half-half. And then there's me, the only Asian on the team as well. So, we have just so many diverse voices and we acknowledge our own different experiences and we bring that to the table. I don't think it is an accident that a lot of Chinese churches and Korean churches will invite me just because I look like them as well too. So that's kind of the stuff that Kaleidoscope does. It's like twofold. We reach out to both pastors to provide training and support. We have a group that meets for parents of LGBTQ teens. So when their kids come out to them, parents are like, oh, I have Christian values, but I don't know what to do, right? I don't know how to love my child. So this is a support group for them. And then on the other hand, we have volunteer opportunities as well. In New York City, like I mentioned, there's a lot of LGBTQ homeless. So we try to partner with things like homeless shelters and relief organizations as well. And the wonderful thing is that, as a church, as a pastor, right, I know how hard outreach is. Right? You go out to the streets, you talk with people, and there's a lot of skepticism and cynicism. And so for a lot of churches, they've been trying to reach the LGBTQ community, but the moment they reach out to the organization, it's like, oh, you're a church, right? Like, we don't really want to work with you. We're a little bit skeptical. But as Kaleidoscope, they see our logo. It's very colorful, and it's very engaging. It's very LGBTQ focused, and they're like, oh, okay, of course. Right? They hear our vision. They're like, oh yeah, we're a faith-based organization, but we're trying to bridge this gap between faith and LGBTQ communities. And a lot of people are actually very, very open to that vision too. So that's the kind of work that Kaleidoscope does. We just launched in April, so we're still setting up a lot of foundational stuff. But you can visit us at kaleidoscopeusa.org. Kaleidoscopeusa.org. Yeah.
That's awesome. I like that as a bridge.
Yes,
I could see that tension where, I don't want to work with you. You're a church, but there's this bridge.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Absolutely.
Other questions?
Julian again. Thank you, PJ, for acknowledging some of the failures of CEC. I'm curious, you talked about how CEC could be better in the future, and I'm just curious of any of your thoughts about what that might look like, either practically or, if not practically, even like what your hopes are, or even for you personally, what you would hope to be better in your relationships with others and things like that.
Yeah. I think, I feel like the goal of the church, a goal of ministry, isn't just to fill the seats or fill the building with people just like yourself. I don't think that was Jesus's ministry. He went out and he just reached whoever basically, came to him. And he was accused of things for doing that. You're just like a glutton and you're a sinner, Jesus. He was accused of that, of just reaching, whether it's the prostitutes, the tax collectors, whoever it was. So, as a follower of Jesus Christ, my hope would be my life and my ministry would reflect my Savior, Jesus' ministry. And so I feel like the church, if we're really true to who Jesus Christ is, would reflect what his ministry looked like, where there would be, say the tax collector, prostitutes, they were like outsiders. There would be people who would be considered outsiders in the church. It doesn't mean I want to shun anybody who does come to CEC. I'm happy people are coming to CEC, but as a body, as a church, and as a leader, as a pastor, I'd hope that we would, be a welcoming place for people who may be considered outsiders, whoever that might be, including, the gay community. More specifically, my hope would be that, there would be that safe space. I think it's kind of been mentioned or touched upon very briefly, but a safe space where the church in general, and CEC is not innocent of it, but the church in general has been accused or called judgmental. And so for that safe space to be a place that would not have judgment upon people, and just be, here's a place where I can just fellowship. Here's a place that I can just be myself. Here's a place that I can learn and grow and be discipled, in the Word and by the Spirit and stuff. So I just, the funny thing, is not the funny thing is, but the church is, full of sinners, and the church fails. But, at the same time, God still uses the church. This is his plan A, and there is no plan B. God still uses the church. So, while we fail, I think hopefully we continue to strive, continue to seek, God's will, follow after Jesus, and hopefully we'll have, more and more people who may be a little bit different than us, and we'll have a place that will be safe for anybody and welcoming for anybody. Gay or otherwise. So that's kind of, I forget the question, but hopefully I answered it.
In being loving to the LGBT community, would you also be loving to a homosexual couple?
Yeah, so that question comes up a lot, right? How do we love LGBTQ people if we don't have kind of we don't affirm LGBTQ or same-sex marriage? How do we still love them? And at what point does loving them become, approving those kinds of things, right? It's interesting because I think as a pastor, I see all kinds of relationships. I work with youth a lot. I work with college students. And in many ways, I'm sure PJ would agree, is that we see a lot of relationships that probably aren't God-centered. There are a lot of relationships that are not godly, and a lot, even in, straight or heterosexual, as you would call it, relationships that probably God would not approve of as well, right? And for us as pastors, acknowledging first and foremost that we have no power to change somebody or control somebody, right? We have no power to change or control a relationship or a marriage or anything like that. Our job is to point people to Jesus within whatever context they're in. Right? Our point is to love a person and to allow them to fix their eyes on the love of Jesus Christ. One that is often very, very, welcoming, very safe, as PJ said. One that is oftentimes also very challenging and very convicting as well, too. So, in terms of that, right? Like, there's no, of course, 5-step process. There's no like, okay, for the first month you do this, and then the second month you do that. In a relationship with a LGBTQ person, I would say just think about what is the process by which you engage and love an LGBTQ couple, and how are you pointing their eyes towards Jesus? And a good measure to ask ourselves that, especially as the church, is, do we have any LGBTQ couples in our church? And if not, or if numbers are lower than the statistical average, then why is that? And what needs to be done so that we can change that as well too. So so I definitely believe that for anybody, right? Like, God desires us to walk in a path according to His will, But what that is, we oftentimes don't know, right? And the messiness of life is oftentimes a lot more complicated than we might think. I'll give another example before I stop with this. But even this is a really good nuance. But even within as PJ identified before, non-affirming or kind of like traditional space, there's so many disagreements. Practically how to live this out. For one thing, a question that often comes up is, should I go to a gay wedding? Right. Even within a traditional church, you're going to find a lot of disagreement. Some people are like, well, actually, like, you shouldn't, because that would be approving. Other people are like, hey, like, if you don't want to lose this relationship with them, right? You think about what it means that you're allowing yourself to be right for one day, and then you're losing the relationship forever, kind of thing. So that's a huge one that comes up. Another one is like, how do you identify yourself? Should we use, oh, I'm just same-sex attracted, or I'm gay? Those kinds of things, right? A number of people have disagreed on this and broken fellowship with each other because of it. And so just thinking about that is this, I hope it's helpful to understand that this issue is very complicated, and that you will not bring everybody to theological conformity on it, or even practical conformity on it. And that's okay. There's a lot of grace, as PJ identified. And, sinners fail to love sinners all the time too. So I think, with that being said, I think the most important thing is to turn somebody's eyes towards Jesus. And I think how you do that, right, is what we're trying to figure out together.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Eva. Thank you so much for asking that. I think I struggle with that question as well. Where's the line between, like, so you want to love, somebody who's gay, but where does that become, you affirm, like, the whole kit and caboodle. I don't know what that term means. But anyways, I just think about my sister and the journey that I've been on with her. And at first, I shared that I just avoided the topic all completely. The thought that comes to my mind as we're talking about this is, first of all, I think we should discuss it and we should talk about it and try to figure things out. And perhaps what you may or may not be comfortable with. But the thought I have is, what's at risk? And thinking specifically about the case with my sisters, like what was at risk if I engage in talking about her being gay or lesbian? And I feel like one of the things that I felt like was at risk was like, oh no, like, her pastor brother is gonna affirm her being gay. And then maybe I'll lose credibility, or I'll lose, orthodoxy or something by it. Or, so, I mean, is that on the table of the risk of loss? Or, is the risk of loss like the relationship between my sister? I feel like that's kind of part of the question is what's at risk? What are we willing to risk in loving? So I don't have the answer practically. It's like, we should go to gay weddings. We should just affirm, any gay family member or friend. Like, I don't know. I don't know how it's, and I think Ray's alluded to it, like, practically speaking, it could look like a lot of different things, right? But for me, part of the thought in thinking through it is what is at stake? What is at risk? Is the truth at risk? Is the is the Word of God at risk? Is the relationships at risk? Is my pride at risk? What is at risk? To think through those questions, as we make some of those decisions to love practically, to not love practically, how we live, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said that there are far more stories in the Gospels of Jesus radically loving people like tax collectors and prostitutes and sinners, rather than Jesus, I guess, quote unquote, sharing his beliefs with them, right? And them kind of being turned off by him and leaving, right? If anything, the times in the Gospels where people walked away from Jesus was when he preached radical inclusion, radical love towards people that society were like, hey, I'm not supposed to love you. I'm not supposed to love these people. So, yeah, anyways, of course, there's a lot of nuance in between, but I think the fact that the gospel writers focused on Jesus' radical love to the point of being criticized by people as being affirming or, like whatever, right? Like a heretic, right? Or a lunatic. There's a lot to be said about that. Yeah.
I think we're almost out of time. Did anybody have any burning questions?
Sorry.
Yeah, one last one? Okay, last question, and then we're going to
Thanks.
wrap it up. Let me just say it out there. We need to pray for us. I forgot to pray in the beginning, so we're going to close with prayer, but last question.
Cool. I think you guys kind of talked about this like throughout the discussion, but I kind of want to ask more about like the differences between like systemic things and individual things regarding the LGBTQ community, because I think from my own personal experience, I think like like people within the LGBTQ community are very diverse. There's a lot of differences, even in politics and opinion, and beliefs too. So it's kind of like, I think a lot of times like Christians who may or may not like be as engaged with that community tend to have like a more stereotyped view because of just what is presented in media. So how do you, I guess, deal with that in, helping Christians like see past I guess kind of what like mainstream media presents or like whatever media presents to like actually engaging with the individual where they are at?
I mean, that's a wonderful question for any kind of systemic issue, right? Whether it's race or immigration. I think that's the point. I think is that we want to acknowledge an extended history of kind of the ways in which this has built up a culture of stigma against the LGBTQ community, while also being prepared to engage with the individual as well. And I think that's the point of discipleship too, right? Is to really acknowledge kind of what it means for the body of Christ to operate as a system, as an institution, as a group, a collective, whatever you want to call it, but also loving individual people in their walks too. The Old Testament, by the way, is filled with systemic issues, right? Systemic issues regarding the poor, regarding the leper, right? Regarding those who are seen as foreigners. And there's a plethora of Bible verses that talk about those kinds of things. Jesus comes in and he's able to fulfill and uphold all those conversations while also loving people in their individual kind of walks too and journeys. So I think that's something that we should definitely strive to follow, acknowledging that there are so many unique individual stories and journeys. There are so many exceptions as well, but also that God is not a stranger to systemic injustice or sin.
Wow, that was a great question. Felt like that was a great answer. My hope is we had a dialogue today. We had some questions that it will continue. These things that we've had over these years and today continue to be like jumping off points for discussion. If you're interested in that group, contact me. I don't know how long you have to stay after, but if you want to ask Ray some more questions offline, I don't know how long you have. Anyway, so maybe I shouldn't say that. But let me close our time in prayer. I know that people have been praying for today, and prayer is powerful. So I pray that this was hopefully a blessing for you here in person, anybody watching online. God's working, and let's close our time with a word of prayer. Father God, you are a God of all compassion and care and love. You're also God of justice and holiness, and you're all those things. And you're not just one over the other. You're all those things. And Father, as we continue to work out our faith with fear and trembling, Lord, would you perhaps give us courage, maybe even some boldness, to have conversations, have dialogues, Lord, discussions, Lord, about what it looks like to believe what the Bible teaches, believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and to love the LGBT community, or actually people, how to love people who may identify as gay, Lord. Help us to unpack that. Help us to struggle with that. Father, I thank you for Pastor Ray, just for his openness, his willingness, his wisdom, Lord. And I want to pray blessings over him and Kaleidoscope. Thank you for that organization that may be a bridge between people and organizations, Lord. So would you bless Kaleidoscope as well, and as Pastor Ray. And just let us continue to journey together, walk together as Christians, just loving one another, holding each other accountable, and just following you, Lord, our Lord and Savior. We love you, and we lift all this up in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.